Blood stained the cobblestones of Oakhaven long before the Alpha King ever arrived. They called her a cur, a broken thing fit only for the scullery, working her until her fingers bled and her spirit fractured. But scars tell a story, and a king was finally listening. The winter of 1452 was recorded in the Oakhaven Chronicles as one of the most brutal in a century. Frost clung to the iron-wrought gates of Castle Blackwood like a disease, and inside the sprawling stone fortress, the cold was merely an extension of Lord Gideon's cruelty. Katerina knelt on the frozen flagstones of the great hall, her raw, blistered hands submerged in a wooden bucket of lye and freezing water. She scrubbed the stone until her joints locked and her knuckles bled, leaving crimson streaks across the gray rock. She was 20 years old, yet her eyes a striking, pale silver held the haunted exhaustion of an ancient crone. In the hierarchy of the Blackwood pack, she was worse than an Omega. She was an unshifted wolf, a genetic failure deemed useless for anything but relentless, agonizing labor. "Faster, you useless mongrel!" A sharp voice cracked like a whip across the cavernous room. Agnes, the head maid, marched forward and delivered a swift, vicious kick to Katerina's ribs. Katerina choked back a gasp, collapsing sideways onto the wet stone, but she did not cry out. Tears were a luxury she had unlearned long ago. Crying only invited Lord Gideon's favorite leather strap or Lady Beatrix's hot iron. "The Alpha King arrives by nightfall," Agnes hissed, her face purple with anxiety. "If the floors do not shine enough to reflect His Majesty's boots, Lady Beatrix will have your hide flayed and hung in the stables. Up." Katerina forced herself upright, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Her body was a tapestry of violence. Beneath the coarse, threadbare sackcloth of her servant's tunic, her back was a lattice of raised white scars and angry red welts. Her left shoulder bore a jagged burn mark from the time she had accidentally spilled lukewarm tea near Lady Beatrix's velvet hem. They had worked her to the absolute brink of human endurance, feeding her only scraps of hardened bread and water tainted with soot. Yet, there was a secret Katerina kept locked tight in her chest, buried beneath layers of trauma and dirt. She was not born a scullery maid. She was the daughter of Beta William of the House of Ashford, a noble lineage that Lord Gideon had slaughtered in a political coup 15 years prior. Gideon had spared her only to humiliate her bloodline, binding her with dark wolfsbane irons during her adolescent years to suppress her wolf entirely. Without her wolf, she was trapped in a fragile human form, easily broken, easily subjugated. The castle was in an absolute frenzy. King Silas of the Vargar dynasty, the sovereign ruler of the northern reaches, was making an unprecedented tour of his southern fiefdoms. Silas was a legend whispered in the dark, a colossal, battle-hardened alpha who had ended the 100 Years' War and dragged the werewolf kingdoms out of the Dark Ages through sheer, brutal force. He was known for his uncompromising justice and his feral, untamed wolf. Lord Gideon was terrified of him. Gideon had been heavily skimming the royal tithes for a decade, oppressing his people to fill his own coffers. If the king looked too closely, Gideon's head would adorn a spike on the castle battlements. "Katerina!" Lady Beatrix's shrill voice echoed from the grand staircase. Beatrix descended in a flurry of crimson silk and sable fur, her face contorted in a sneer of absolute disgust as she looked at the kneeling girl. "Why is this creature still in my sight? The royal outriders have been spotted at the ridge. Get her to the kitchens, and cover those hideous arms. If the king sees such a repulsive, scarred wretch in my hall, I will cut out her tongue." Katerina bowed her head, her damp hair falling over her face as a shield. "Yes, my lady," she rasped, her voice rough from disuse. She dragged the heavy bucket toward the servants' corridor, every muscle screaming in protest. As she passed the polished silver shields hung along the corridor, she caught a fleeting glimpse of her reflection, hollowed cheeks, bruised eyes, and skin pale as death. She was a ghost haunting her own life. She felt the heavy, rhythmic throb of her heart and wondered, not for the first time, how much longer it would beat before her body finally surrendered to the abyss. Down in the sweltering, smoke-filled kitchens, the heat was a violent contrast to the freezing hall. The cooks shoved her from station to station. She plucked pheasants until her fingers cramped, turned the massive iron spit over the roaring hearth until the heat singed her eyelashes, and carried sacks of flour that weighed more than she did. By the time the massive war horn sounded from the outer courtyard, signaling the Alpha King's arrival, Katerina was swaying on her feet, her vision tunneling into dark, suffocating pinpricks. "They are here," a kitchen boy whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Katerina leaned against the soot-stained brick of the oven, closing her eyes. She prayed to the moon goddess, a deity she wasn't sure even listened to unshifted wolves anymore, that the king would eat his meal, take his tithe, and leave without incident. Because Katerina knew, with a dark, terrifying certainty, that she would not survive another beating. The doors of the great hall blew open with the force of a winter gale. King Silas strode into Castle Blackwood, and the sheer, crushing weight of his aura dropped every wolf in the vicinity to their knees. Silas was a mountain of a man, clad in blackened steel armor and a cloak of midnight wolf fur. His jaw was lined with a neat, dark beard, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sea, piercing, intelligent, and fiercely dangerous. Beside him walked his beta, Leif, a tall, silent warrior whose hand never strayed far from the pommel of his broadsword. Lord Gideon, sweating profusely despite the chill, groveled at the base of the dais. "Your Majesty, welcome to Oakhaven. We are humbled by your radiant presence." Silas stared down at the trembling Alpha, his expression unreadable. His inner wolf, a massive, primordial beast, was pacing restlessly in his mind. For weeks, a strange, undeniable pull had been drawing Silas southward. It was an instinct older than blood, a phantom scent on the wind that tasted like rain and crushed pine needles. He had come to Oakhaven not just for taxes, but because his soul was screaming at him that something here belonged to him. "Rise, Gideon," Silas commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the stone walls. "Let us hope your hospitality matches the generous reports you send my treasury." The feast began. It was a grotesque display of wealth that Silas immediately noted with deep suspicion. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, spun sugar sculptures, and flagons of spiced imported wine. Silas sat at the high table, picking at his food, his sharp gaze dissecting the room. He noted the nervous guards, the ostentatious jewels on Lady Beatrix's neck, and the distinct undercurrent of fear that laced the scent of the castle's inhabitants. In the shadows of the servants' entrance, Katerina was handed a massive, ornate silver tray laden with scalding hot mulled wine. It was meant for the high table. "Take it," Agnes shoved her forward. "And keep your head down. Do not look at him." Katerina stepped into the blinding light of the great hall. The noise was deafening, the clash of silver, the raucous laughter of Gideon's inner circle, the crackle of the massive hearth. She focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, balancing the heavy tray. Her arms trembled violently. The burns on her back from the previous week flared with agonizing heat as the coarse tunic rubbed against them. She approached the dais. Lady Beatrix eyed her with venomous warning. Just as Katerina reached the steps, a high-ranking Omega named Cecily, a spiteful girl who curried favor with Beatrix by tormenting the lower servants, conveniently stretched out her foot, hooking it sharply around Katerina's ankle. Time seemed to slow. Katerina stumbled, the massive silver tray tilted. Knowing that spilling scalding wine on the royal table would mean an immediate death sentence, Katerina did the only thing she could. She twisted her body violently mid-air, pulling the tray backward against her own chest. The silver crashed to the stone floor with a deafening clatter. The boiling hot, spiced wine splashed entirely over Katerina's front, soaking through her thin tunic. Katerina hit the ground hard, her head cracking against the edge of the dais. The pain of the boiling liquid searing her flesh was blinding. Absolute agony. But she bit completely through her lower lip to stifle the scream. Blood welled in her mouth. The great hall plunged into an absolute, deathly silence. Lord Gideon's face turned an apoplectic shade of red. He leaped to his feet, overturning his chair. "You clumsy, worthless cur!" he roared, terrified that the king had been offended. He stormed down the steps, drawing the heavy, steel-tipped riding crop he always kept at his belt. "I will flay you alive for this insult. Guards, drag this filth to the courtyard. 50 lashes." Katerina curled into a ball on the floor, shivering uncontrollably from shock, pain, and the freezing stone. She closed her eyes, waiting for the brutal hands of the guards. She was ready. She was finally going to rest. But the hands never came. Instead, a monstrous, terrifying snarl ripped through the hall. It was a sound so loud, so dripping with primal violence, that the windows rattled in their frames. Silas had vaulted over the high table. His massive frame landed squarely between the cowering Katerina and a trembling Lord Gideon. The Alpha King's eyes had bled from stormy gray to a luminous, unnatural gold. His fangs were fully descended, and the lethal claws of his wolf had torn through the leather of his gauntlets. "To mine." The voice of Silas's wolf echoed in his mind, obliterating all reason, all diplomacy, all sanity. The moment the girl's blood had hit the air, mingled with the scent of rain and crushed pine, Silas's soul had recognized its other half, his mate, and she was bleeding on the floor, soaked in scalding wine, dressed in literal rags. Gideon froze, the riding crop held limply in his hand. "Your Majesty?" Silas didn't look at Gideon. Slowly, deliberately, the king knelt on the wine-soaked stone. The terrifying aura radiating from him made it hard for anyone in the room to breathe. He reached out with a trembling, massive hand. Katerina flinched violently, expecting a strike, curling tighter into herself. The flinch sent a physical shockwave of pain through Silas's chest. "Peace, little one," he murmured, his voice suddenly agonizingly gentle, a stark contrast to the beast that had just roared. "I will not harm you." Gently, he brushed the damp, soot-stained hair from her face. As he did, the collar of her ruined, oversized tunic slipped down her shoulder. Silas's breath hitched. Beneath the wet fabric, her flesh was a horrific canvas of suffering. He saw the raised, jagged lines of recent whippings. He saw the dark, puckered skin of old burns. He saw the unmistakable indentations of wolfsbane shackles on her wrists. He saw a lifetime of systematic, unbroken torture. Silas traced a particularly brutal, fresh scar on her collarbone with the tip of his thumb. Katerina looked up at him, her pale silver eyes wide and uncomprehending. She was shivering violently, her lips blue, blood trailing from the corner of her mouth. "Who did this to you?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the dead silent hall. "I..." Katerina choked on the blood in her mouth. "I am just a scullery maid, my lord. I am sorry for the mess." Silas closed his eyes. A single, furious tear slipped down the rugged plane of his cheek. When he opened his eyes again, the golden light of his wolf was so bright it was blinding. He stood up, turning his back on his mate, and faced Lord Gideon. The temperature in the room plummeted. The king drew his broadsword, the dark steel singing a deadly note in the quiet hall. "You have 10 seconds, Gideon," King Silas said, his voice a flat, dead void of absolute murderous intent. 10 seconds to tell me why my destined mate is wearing rags and carrying the scars of 1,000 tortures. And then, I am going to tear this castle apart, stone by bloody stone. The silence in the great hall was no longer just quiet. It was the suffocating stillness of a graveyard right before the dead rise. Lord Gideon's face drained of all color, his arrogant posture crumbling into pathetic terror. "Mate," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically to the bloodied girl on the floor, then back to the towering king. "Your Majesty, there must be a mistake. She is a defective cur, an unshifted weakling. She has no lineage, no..." Before the word could fully leave his mouth, King Silas moved. It was a blur of blackened steel and raw, predatory speed. Silas's gauntleted hand clamped around Gideon's throat, lifting the hefty alpha clean off the ground, as if he weighed nothing more than a bundle of dry twigs. Gideon choked, his legs kicking uselessly in the air. "Every syllable you speak poisons the air she breathes," Silas growled, the vibration of his fury cracking the stone tiles under his boots. He hurled Gideon backward. The Lord of Oakhaven smashed into the high table, splintering oak and sending roasted boar and silver platters crashing to the floor in a chaotic avalanche. Lady Beatrix shrieked, scrambling backward, her silk gown catching on broken wood. "Guards, protect your alpha!" she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. A dozen Oakhaven guards drew their swords, but before they could take a single step, Beta Leaf's broadsword cleared its scabbard with a deadly, ringing hiss. Leaf did not yell. He simply leveled his blade at the captain of the guard, his eyes icy. The first man to step forward dies. The second man dies faster. Choose your loyalties carefully, gentlemen. You serve the Vargar crown, or you serve a dead man. The guards hesitated, looking at the furious king, and slowly, one by one, their swords clattered to the stone. Silas ignored them all. He crouched back down beside Katerina. She was slipping into unconsciousness, the combination of shock, scalding burns, and blood loss finally dragging her under. Her pale silver eyes fluttered. "Maester Eris!" Silas roared over his shoulder. A frail but quick-moving man in dark gray robes rushed forward from the royal entourage, a leather satchel clutched to his chest. He dropped to his knees beside the king. Eris took one look at Katerina's ruined skin, her ragged breathing, and the horrifying scars visible through the tear in her tunic. The royal healer's face tightened with professional rage. "She is burning up, sire. The wine was boiling, and she is malnourished. Her body is shutting down. We need to get her out of this draft, away from this filth." "Prepare my personal carriage," Silas commanded, carefully sliding his arms under her battered frame. He lifted her as if she were spun glass, mindful of the terrible burns on her chest and the whip marks on her back. Katerina's head rolled against his chest, her soot-stained cheek resting right over his heart. "You cannot take her!" Beatrix cried out, clutching her jewels. "She is pack property! She owes us a life debt for feeding her all these years." Silas turned, Katerina cradled safely in his arms. The look he gave Beatrix made the arrogant woman freeze, the blood turning to ice in her veins. "Leif," Silas said softly, "arrest them both. Tear the castle apart. Find the ledger, find the dungeons, find every wretched secret this rat has hidden. If anyone resists, burn them out." As Silas carried his mate out of the hall, Katerina's weak voice whispered against his armor. "The cellar," she murmured deliriously. "Don't let them." "The cellar," Silas halted. He looked down at her flushed, pain-contorted face. "What is in the cellar, little one?" "The bloodstones." Katerina coughed, a thin line of red spilling over her lip. "For the harvest." Silas's eyes narrowed. Blood magic was outlawed across the realm, a dark and parasitic art that drained life force from one wolf to feed another or the land. He looked back at Gideon, who was now pinned to the floor by Leif's heavy boot. Gideon's eyes were wide with undeniable guilt. "So," Silas whispered, the truth snapping into place. "She is not an unshifted weakling. You bound her wolf with dark magic to siphon her strength for your own failing lands." He looked closely at Katerina's face, tracing the delicate structure of her jaw, the specific hue of her silver eyes. Recognition dawned on him like a thunderclap. Silver eyes. "The House of Ashford," Silas announced, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. "Beta William's daughter. You told the crown the Ashford line died out from winter fever 15 years ago." Gideon sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. "We needed the magic. The soil was dying. The pack would have starved without a royal bloodline to tether the earth. You tortured a child for 15 years to line your own pockets with grain," Silas corrected, his voice devoid of mercy. "Leif, put Gideon and Beatrix in the wolfsbane shackles they used on my mate. Lock them in their own dungeons. Tomorrow, I will execute them myself." With that, the Alpha King carried Katerina out into the freezing night, leaving the broken tyranny of Oakhaven in ruins behind him. The journey to Winterkeep, the royal fortress nestled high in the frost-peaked jagged mountains, took 3 agonizing days. For Katerina, It was a blur of fever dreams, searing pain, and a strange, constant warmth that anchored her to the world of the living. Whenever she stirred, crying out from the phantom sting of Agnes's kicks or the boiling wine, a large, calloused hand would gently stroke her hair. A low, rumbling voice would hum an old, forgotten lullaby, chasing the nightmares away. When she finally opened her eyes with clarity, Katerina expected to see the soot-stained brick of the scullery. Instead, she was surrounded by opulence. A massive hearth crackled with fragrant cedar logs. The bed she lay on was softer than clouds, draped in heavy velvet and silk. She panicked, trying to scramble backward, but her muscles screamed in protest. Her entire upper torso was wrapped in pristine white bandages smelling of aloe and sweet herbs. "Easy," a gentle voice cautioned. Katerina froze. King Silas was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, a heavy tome resting on his lap. He wore simple dark tunics now, his armor discarded, but the sheer power radiating from him was still overwhelmingly absolute. "You are safe," Silas said, closing the book and setting it aside. He didn't move closer, clearly reading the terror in her posture. "You are at Winterkeep. Maester Eris has treated your burns. You have been asleep for a week." "A week?" Katerina rasped, her throat incredibly dry. Silas stood, pouring a goblet of fresh, cool water from a crystal pitcher. He approached the bed slowly, telegraphing his movements. He offered her the goblet. Katerina stared at it, then at him. Nobody had ever offered her water without expecting her to scrub a floor for it. She took it with trembling, bandaged hands, drinking greedily. "Why?" Katerina asked softly, staring down at the silver rim of the cup. "Why did you save me?" "I am nothing. A ruined thing." Silas's jaw tightened. "You are not ruined. You were stolen from, abused, and hidden away. And you are not nothing." He stepped closer, dropping to one knee beside the bed so that their eyes were level. "You are my mate, Katerina of House Ashford." Katerina flinched at her true name. "My wolf is dead," she whispered, tears finally pooling in her silver eyes. "Lord Gideon used iron needles dipped in black nightshade. He pierced my spine when I was a child. He said if I ever tried to call my wolf, the poison would stop my heart." "I am broken, Your Majesty." "Silas," he corrected gently. "My name is Silas. And your wolf is not dead. She is just sleeping behind a wall of pain. We found the runic circle in the cellar. We destroyed it. The siphon is broken." Katerina shook her head, fear gripping her chest. "The needles, they are still inside me. Maester Eris says they can be removed," Silas explained, his voice thick with a mixture of hope and dread. "But the surgery is perilous. It requires extracting the corrupted iron from your spinal column. If we do nothing, the nightshade will eventually poison your human heart, as your body grows stronger and fights the foreign magic. If we do it, you might not survive the shock." Katerina looked at the man who had torn down her oppressors. For 15 years, her choices had been made for her. When to eat, when to sleep, when to bleed. Now, the most powerful man in the world was kneeling before her, asking for her permission. "Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Silas answered honestly, refusing to lie to her. "More than anything you have endured, but I will be holding your hand the entire time. I swear it on my soul." Katerina closed her eyes. She thought of the dark, damp cellar. She thought of Agnes's cruel laughter and Beatrix's hot irons. Then, she thought of the strange, beautiful warmth of the mate bond humming just below her ribs, a promise of a life she had never dared to dream of. "Take them out," she whispered. The procedure was a grueling ordeal that tested the very limits of Katerina's fragile body. For hours, Maester Eris worked with delicate silver instruments, carefully extracting the blackened, cursed iron splinters from the base of her spine. Silas never left her side. He held her hand, pouring his own alpha strength into her through the mate bond, anchoring her life force to his own when her heart rate plummeted dangerously low. When the final splinter was pulled free, Katerina let out an agonizing, ear-piercing scream that echoed through the stone halls of Winterkeep. And then, a sound that had not been heard in her soul for 15 years answered. A howl. It started low, a rumble deep within her chest, and erupted into a blinding flash of silver light. The magic that had been suppressed for a decade and a half exploded outward, shattering the glass windows of the bedchamber and knocking Maester Eris off his feet. Silas shielded his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs. When the light faded, the frail, scarred girl was gone. Standing in the center of the ruined room was a magnificent, enormous wolf. Her fur was the color of fresh snowfall kissed by moonlight, shimmering with an ethereal silver glow. She was an Ashford Alpha, radiant, terrifying, and breathtakingly beautiful. The silver wolf looked at Silas. There was no fear in her pale eyes now, only recognition, only power. She padded forward, her massive paws silent against the stone, and pressed her large head against Silas's chest. Silas buried his hands in her thick fur, burying his face in her neck, a ragged sob tearing loose from his throat. The mate bond snapped fully into place, a golden, unbreakable thread connecting their souls. "Welcome back, my queen," Silas whispered. Months later, the court of Winterkeep gathered in the grand throne room. The nobility whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Today was the official coronation of the new Luna Queen. The heavy oak doors swung open. Katerina walked down the crimson runner, and the entire room held its breath. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, intricately embroidered with silver threads, but it wasn't the dress that commanded their attention. It was her posture. Her shoulders were pulled back, her chin held high, radiating an aura of quiet, unyielding authority. She had specifically chosen a gown with a low back and sheer sleeves. She did not hide her scars. The faint white lines crisscrossing her skin were visible for all to see. They were no longer marks of shame. They were medals of survival. She had walked through hell, and she had emerged wearing the flames as a crown. Silas stood by the throne, his eyes filled with a fierce, possessive pride as he watched his mate approach. He took her hand, kissing the faint burn scar on her knuckles, before turning to face his kingdom. "Behold your queen!" Silas's voice boomed, echoing with absolute finality. Katerina looked out at the sea of faces. She thought of Oakhaven, of the dark scullery, of the girl who had scrubbed floors until she bled. That girl was gone, transformed by fire, by pain, and by a love that refused to let her break. The scullery maid had died on the cold stones of Castle Blackwood. The Silver Queen of Winterkeep had risen in her place. Scars are not just reminders of the violence we have suffered. They are the ultimate proof that the blade did not defeat us. Katerina's journey from a broken scullery maid to a formidable Luna Queen proved that true strength is forged in the darkest fires. With King Silas by her side, she ruled with unyielding justice and fierce empathy, a living testament to the enduring power of survival and redemption.